Eli tervetuloa Sitran Sivistys plus aamukahveille, Minna Salami. Warm welcome to our morning coffee event, Minna. It's great to have you here, and we are very much looking forward to your inspirational ideas and thoughts. Floor is yours. Ole hyvä.
Thank you. Kiitos. Kiitos ja Sannalle ja Sitralle. Mä aloitan ihan lyhyesti suomeksi ja sanon, miten kiva on olla täällä. Mä oon Lontoossa, täällä on kello 7 ja vielä on aika pimeätä, mutta mä oon nähnyt jo kommenteista, että teillä on Suomessa aurinkoinen päivä. Ja kiitos kaikille, jotka on täällä. Eli jatkan englanniksi. Good morning, everyone. And as Sanna said, I'm Minna Salami, and I am an author and a feminist theorist. And I've recently been doing a lot of research on topics that have to do with Sivistys, which doesn't really have an equivalent word in English, but one of the research organizations that I work with, Perspectiva, and who does look at this same concept, we call it realization, and this is similar to the German and Swedish Bildung. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have a bit of a presentation, but I'm not going to be too formal. It's early in the morning. This is a coffee meeting. But I do have some notes that I will have a look at from time to time. So let's see if I can get my screen. Great. So the title of my talk is The Other Side of the Mountain. And the question that I want to explore this morning is, how would we perceive knowledge if knowledge and our universal concepts were not only defined by Europatriarchal worldviews? So throughout history, the key ideas about who we are as a human species and about who we should be have been shaped by a very small group of people. Men like Karl Marx and Foucault and Derrida and Jean-Paul Sartre and Nietzsche, who else have I listed here? Sigmund Freud and Immanuel Kant have all had a lot to say about who we are. And sometimes their views have been very wise. And of course, sometimes they have been narrow-minded and exploitative and destructive even. But the point is more that it has always been the same small group, which is a demographic of elite European heritage men who have had the most say about universal concepts. So it has been their ideas and arguments and values and beliefs and attitudes and preoccupations that dominate our political and our cultural and aesthetic, philosophical, social, economic institutions. So this group has been the group that are the world's, that are like the Nobel Prize recipients, the authors, the philosophers, the scientists, and so on. I don't want to disregard the work of European heritage men. By no means because they are white and male, or because the ideas have all been categorically flawed. As I mentioned, there have been important contributions made by this group, and also being familiar of what it is like when one's group is categorically vilified in society. That is a practice that I don't have any desire to continue. But nevertheless, the consequences of only one small demographic shaping the direction of all of humanity are huge. So for one, it has led to class, race, and gender oppression. And of course, all of these oppressions eventually lead to suffering that affect all of us ultimately. Bob Marley quoted that, you know, when the rain falls, it doesn't fall on only one house. And ultimately, the situations that we can see around the world today, from climate emergency to police brutality to refugee crises, these are things that affect everyone. And the exploitation, the manifestation of this kind of small group dominance in today's world is not always as direct as in wars and refugee crises and things like that. We also are living with many indirect and more subtle forms of suffering, such as unconscious biases and things like that. And then, of course, we have the very direct forms of oppression that we can name, such as violence against women and slavery and colonialism. The list of damages are basically very long, and we could talk about them all day, but the consequence that Europatriarchal dominance has had, that actually is the most dire in some sense, because it identifies the root of the many problems that we face in the 21st century, is that we are unable, when only one demographic shapes society, it leads to us our being unable to really grasp reality and to have a clarity about who we are individually and in our societies. So it really prevents us from gaining the kind of understanding that can lead to freedom. And there's a story that I like to tell that really kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to say here, and I call it the mountain. So a long time ago, imagine a small village where one person had heard, or the whole village had heard about this mountain that contained lots of treasures that could make their society rich. And so you had an explorer who went to the mountain to go and search for all of these treasures. And he came back months later saying that, I found the mountain, but unfortunately it was arid. There was nothing there. And then everybody forgot about the mountain. But there was one person who couldn't let go of the story and who thought that there must be something to it, and went off on their own expedition. And months later, when she came back, she said, I found the mountain, and actually it was really lush. It was rich with flora and fauna and all kinds of vegetable land, and everyone rejoiced because now they knew that the mountain was going to make their society wealthy and prosperous. And I share this brief story because that's kind of what we are finding ourselves at the precipice of in today's society, where we have been only having access to one side of the mountain. So when we're looking at the mountain story, we're talking about a physical kind of natural element, but the same concept, or the imbued meaning in that is the same when it comes to things like power, our understanding of knowledge at large. We only have one interpretation that is so dominant in our cultural education and in civic discussion about some of the most fundamental things that ultimately shape all of our lives. So we don't have the other side of the mountain. For example, if you think about a concept like power, it isn't possible that power can mean the same thing to Black people, say, as it does to white people. And of course, it's important to say that I'm generalizing here. Power also does not mean exactly the same thing to every white person, but as a general notion. And similarly, if you thought of something like the notion of beauty and truth and aesthetics, all of these things could not possibly mean the same thing to women as a group, as they do to men as a group, given the history that we've all been through. And in a world where there's about 8 billion people and so much political polarization, it starts to become really urgently imperative that we see all sides of the metaphorical mountain. And for me, working as a Black African heritage woman in the world of ideas, I kind of am the second explorer who went to the mountain and who came back with a different view than what the first explorer had seen. And so what I've been doing in my work and in my book, Sensuous Knowledge, which in Finnish is Aistien viisaus, is to try to convey what it's like, being on the other side of the mountain when it comes to ideas, when it comes to knowledge. And of course, knowledge is what informs realization, or sivistys. And ultimately, the goal with that is, yes, to resist oppression, but even more importantly, to create a more vibrant understanding of the world so that we can figure out how to coexist in this very polemical time, and to not only to coexist, but perhaps even potentially, rise to a higher elevation of humanity, which is the goal of Sivistys, I would argue. And so what I do in my work is to synthesize and to interweave different worlds, where patriarchal knowledge has typically wanted to divide and separate and create hierarchies. And the method of interweaving, which I call Aistien viisaus, or sensuous knowledge, is rooted in Black feminist thought. And and this is really where we can, what we can learn from Black feminism when it comes to Sivistys today. Black feminists have always, if there's one quality that you could say is central to classic Black feminist thought, it is the quality of interconnection. So Black feminists, by nature of being Black, female, and quite often belonging to the working class or the disenfranchised class, have always understood the interconnections between oppressions and between different social structures. So there's no other ideology, if you think of socialism, Marxism, Black liberation, feminism as it has existed in the Western European world, there's no other ideological school which has really thought about the interconnections between, the economy, social politics, gender politics, racial politics, etc., in the way that Black feminists have almost had to do. I don't mean to say that no other groups have ever thought about these interweavings, but when we think of the Black female struggle, what it also has done is to bring into the conversation of epistemology, of knowledge production, of wisdom, if you like, the interconnections not only of these political realities, but also of the body, and therefore the arts and the natural world, poetry, a kind of poetic sensibility. And this has a lot to do with the fact that Black women have historically been denied access to institutions of power, including educational institutions. And so out of necessity, we have had to utilize imaginative formulations in order to share knowledge as a group. And so within the worlds of art, of say gardening, of pottery, of dance, you find that a lot of Black feminist thought has emerged from that. And the point of this today is that, oh, sorry, I have something, oops, emerging on my screen. Okay, we can just leave that there. So when we are speaking today about Sivistys, the real important question, I think, is what is the point of education? What is the point of civic discussion? How do we create shifts that are not only external, but also in our inner worlds? And this is really where Black feminism can contribute to these conversations for all of us. I think a lot of the challenges, the huge challenges that we're facing, from the climate emergency to the pandemic and so on, are all framed by a kind of meta crisis. So there's a dissonance between who we think we are and what we actually are, and who we and the kind of knowledge we're producing and what can actually explain reality to us. And so, for example, when we think now of Black feminist knowledge production, and I want to say that there's no kind of monolith, and there's as many Black feminisms as there are Black feminists, but that you could identify a kind of what I would call classic Black feminist thought. In today's society, there's the notion intersectionality, which is typically associated with Black feminism. Some of you might have heard this term. And intersectionality is looking at again the connections between things, and it emanates from a legal case in the 1990s, where it became kind of impossible to distinguish whether the woman who was filing the case had experienced discrimination based on her race or on her gender. And from that, there began these discussions that, when you look at Black women as a group, it's quite difficult to disentangle these issues. But intersectionality, I mean, for one, I'd say it has now started to, because it has become so popular in civic discussion, it has started to transform into something that it wasn't originally. And that is fine. That's what happens to concepts. But it is therefore more interesting to me to just look at the thread of within classic Black feminist thought of interconnection, which has always been there. And so I have this slide up because one of the kinds of different perspectives that a Black feminist approach can bring to the discussion around Sivistys is something that I have worked and researched a lot on, which is Yoruba philosophy and mythology, and the philosophical compendium of Yorubas. Yoruba, by the way, is an ethnic group in what today is Nigeria. There is about at least 20 million Yorubas in Nigeria, but probably much more, and spread around the world. So you find Yoruba philosophy active in Brazil, in Cuba, in the US, and all across the diaspora. But this is just one example. So in Ifa, which is the compendium of Yoruba thought, there is the word for knowledge, or for phronesis, which is the philosophical term for practical wisdom. The word for knowledge is ogbon, and the reason that I have this slide here is that Olorun and Olokun on the left and right, respectively, are the kind of creation gods. And they create the legend, the story around Ogbon, which is knowledge, was that they created Ogbon so that humanity could thrive. But they created, they split Ogbon into two. So you had Ogbon Ori and Ogbon Inu, which respectively mean knowledge of the head and knowledge of the gut. So you could say intellectual knowledge and emotional intelligence in the language we use these days. And they split it into two because they said that the idea was that if you don't have the two of them, you are only partly wise. And so it was incentive to pursue both Ogbon Ori and Ogbon Inu. Now, if we contrast that with conventional, the dominant kind of cultural education that we have today, which is that that all worthy insight is to do with that which can be measured. So I don't even want to just say the rational or the intellectual, because in Ogbon and in my own work, I emphasize that this isn't sensuous knowledge is not antithetical to rational thinking. By contrast, it is trying to complement it, to expand it, because we have, of course, rationality to thank for so many things that are of immense value to humanity, from universities to the contemporary kind of healthcare system, technology, etc., etc. But the prevailing way that we look at knowledge production and epistemic insight is that it has to be something that we can measure, and that in return, in many layered ways, perpetuates the need for domination and exploitation, because it creates a sense of hierarchy and a sense that the cosmos is like a kind of megaplex shopping center from which mankind needs to draw from and can take as much as he wants, and consequently it leads to the kind of to the domestication of the non-human natural world and of women. So in this alternative worldview, there is a bringing together, a synthesis of the intellectual and the emotional. So rather than saying either or, the thinking is about with and within, and it's a synthesis of things like the arts and the sciences, storytelling with academic research, basically really trying to get at what is our real experiences as human beings. So where does this leave us then in terms of Sivistys? What is the thing that we are kind of seeking to do when we merge Black feminist thought into this space? And I think quite often in similar conversations, what can happen is a sense that what we are trying to do is to acknowledge a problematic history, or to offer some kind of some atonement, some consolation, some regret, or something like that, or even to foster a sense of compassion for people who are the other. But I would say that it isn't about those things, first and foremost, and even at all, in a sense. I think we are at a place in in our evolution, that we have to start to think bigger because of the many crises that we face. And we have to, so the point of it is really to foster a sense of a we rather than an us and a them. And that we is a very complicated we, but it is to really help us to start to do that. Because if Sivistys is a coming into like an understanding of complexity, it's a kind of civic education, I would say, and a civic education in 2021 and beyond is not what a civic education was when our ancestors were conceptualizing Sivistys, Bildung, all of these things. Then it was more about having phronesis, practical knowledge, as I mentioned earlier. But now civic education is about being able to grasp complexity. And so if we're going to do that, then an understanding of different types of knowledge, different epistemic worldviews, different approaches, different contributions within different worlds, again, the kind of the political and the aesthetic, the arts, the sciences, etc., is an essential part of what Sivistys is. I have forgotten to move my slides, but this is probably a good place to end. I think I've been speaking for my time slot. So I have here on the screen an image of a cacophony and a symphony, and yeah, I think that this, we're striving to create a kind of symphonious society, and I think in terms of Sivistys. And at the moment, we are more of a cacophony. And so really bringing together many different worldviews, as much insight so that we can really get a grasping of reality and understanding, which leads to freedom, is the ultimate goal. Thank you.